Good morning. You haven't been here recently in the past or don't know who I am. My name is Curt Wyse. For the last 20 some years, my wife and I have been running JW's Foods, but I'm not originally from this area. Those of you that like to play the game might be a little bit more difficult. I grew up in South America where my parents were serving as missionaries. They have since retired to Florida. And today happens to be my father's 94th birthday, and I know he'll be listening in, so happy birthday, Dad. Several years ago, getting to be more all the time, but I finally acknowledged God's call on my life to be involved in ministry and to preach. And so I do that now by filling in at various churches that are understaffed or just need someone to help out. I'm also a bit of a runner. I don't know how many runners there are here. Did anybody else? I know Shaylee. Did anybody else run the key wash yesterday? Hands up. Anybody else run? No. No. See, so I'm a little bit of an odd duck, I guess. I've wanted for years to run a marathon. Something that's just kind of been on my bucket list. Twice I started training. One time I got into it too quick and I injured myself. And so I had to give up my training. The other time I was doing really well. It was in 2020, and if you remember what 2020 was like, COVID, and they canceled the marathon. So that was kind of my running. But in Washington on the Key Wash, they have a race every year. They have a 5K, a 10K, and a half marathon. I've run those the half marathon several times, and last year they announced for the first time they were going to have a full marathon in Washington. And I thought, great, it's not very far away. And so since January, I've been training for a marathon. The training was a lot more work than I anticipated. On paper, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 miles, it doesn't look that bad. When you try to fit that into a schedule when you're working full time and doing other things, that's a lot of time. And so I was training. A few weeks ago, I ran into someone on a training run. I was doing an 8 mile run, kind of winding down. I'd gotten the real long runs out of the way. And I met someone. We were talking a little bit as we were there. And he said, yeah, he goes, after that marathon, he goes, I don't have anything planned. I'm taking Sunday off and I'm taking Monday off to recover. And it's then that I realized how foolish I am because I was scheduled to preach twice today and work a full week this week. And so if I'm limping a little bit this morning, it's because the ibuprofen's not doing everything that I wanted it to do. Um, but I finished a marathon yesterday for the first time and the last time. So, uh, about a month or two ago, Pastor Don and I we were having lunch like we do, and we were looking at the calendar over what was coming up, who's preaching when, and what we're going to be preaching on. And we Pastor Don maps those out uh, a few months in advance, and so we were looking at this is when we were hot and heavy in Matthew. And Don said, I think we're going to be going back to the Old Testament for a while. We're going to go back to the book of Judges. And I was like, yes, yes, because I love the Old Testament, right? I don't like all the laws and the regulations. I don't like all of the census and the instructions for building the temple and whatnot. I don't like that, but I like the stories of the people in the Old Testament because I don't know them as well. I mean, we have heard countless sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, countless sermons on the prodigal son. But a lot of these accounts in the Old Testament, I don't know near as well. And so I love digging into them and seeing what I can find. And that's what we're going to do a little bit this morning. And so this morning we're going to be talking about a man named Barak. And there's some of you that I say that, and you probably immediately know who Barak is and what it's about. And there's some of you that maybe saw on the bulletin and read the passage already and know. And there's others of you that are going, Barak? Who in the world is Barak? So if you have your Bibles this morning, digital or paper, I encourage you to open them up to Judges chapter 4. And I'm going to have the main verses up on the screen behind me. But here's what it's like. When you have your own Bible, you can see all the details. Because I could tell you something. I could tell you that yesterday in this marathon, I was the 53rd person to cross the finish line, right? I could tell you that I was first in my age group. I was the first guy in his 60s to cross the finish line. And that's true, but if you had the complete results, the picture would look a little bit different. Because you see, there were only less than 100 people that actually finished the race. And in my age group, there were only 3, and the other 2 guys were in their later 60s. And you would also see that there was a guy in his 70s that smoked me. So, it doesn't say a whole lot. And if you really know anything about marathons, I saw on my Facebook feed this morning that for the first time, a Kenyan, because they're great runners, he broke the 2-hour mark for a 26-mile race. I mean, I was lucky to break 5 hours. This guy, he did it in under 2 for the first time in history. So, when you have the scriptures in front of you, what it amounts to is you can see the rest of those details. You can see what I leave out. And so I'll put some of the stuff up here, and I'm not trying to leave things out to fool you, but we only have so much time. And so when you have the scriptures, you can see some other details that maybe I'm leaving out. You can get a little bit better picture. And that's why I always like it when you have your own Bibles and you can open them. So in Judges, we see this pattern that's repeated over and over and over. I love these new projectors. Right? So the pattern starts out with Israel serving God faithfully. Right? They have a leader, a good spiritual leader, and they're following God faithfully, and then the leader dies. And the people drift away. Makes me realize how important leadership is. And they fail the test that Pastor Don talked about last week. They make poor moral decisions. Right? And it ends up with God allowing this occupation or military oppression of the people to try to get their attention again. And eventually the people, they realize that they're getting what they deserve for their unfaithfulness. And so they begin to cry out to God for help and deliverance. God hears their prayers. God raises up a deliverer. He raises up a new judge. And then that judge leads them through deliverance back to God. And they remain faithful. They faithfully serve God until the judge dies and the whole process starts again. This moral failure, this God brought on punishment through other nations, a cry for help, the God ordained deliverer that he raises up, followed by a time of peace. And throughout this, we see God using people. He uses other nations to punish Israel for their sins. He uses the judges to provide relief, to deliver his people, and uses the judges to provide leadership and to help his people remain faithful. And we see this pattern over and over again throughout the book. So last week, Don talked about this and about testing, and would the people be faithful? Would they fail the test or would they pass the test? And it seems like they often failed. So picking up Judges chapter 4 with verse 1. We got a clicker and I can't run it. There we go. We got a new clicker. Apparently I was the last person to use it here and it disappeared. We've got a clicker again. Judges chapter 4, verse 1. It says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud had died. So the Lord sold them to King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Hasheroth of the nations. And the Israelites cried out to the Lord because Jabin had 900 iron chariots, and he harshly oppressed them for 20 years. So we see this pattern. It says again the people did what was wrong, right? It's this pattern. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They failed the test. They'd been faithful during the time of Ehud, right? He had been their judge, their leader. They'd been faithful. Once he died, they reverted to their sinful ways. And so in verse 2, God responds. God sent this punishment. He sent this occupation through King Jabin of Canaan and through Sisera, the commander of his army. And then the Israelites, they cried out for mercy. They cried out to God for someone to save them. It's the same pattern we're seeing repeated. And King Jabin, he was powerful. He had 900 chariots. 900. Do you remember how many chariots Pharaoh sent out after the Israelites when they left? Even Don's thinking about this. I figured he would know it right off. When when Pharaoh sent out after the Israelites, there were what 2 or 3 million Israelites that left Egypt. He sent 600 chariots. King Jabin he's got 30% more, 33% more than that. This is a huge army, right? This is intimidating. And so that's kind of our background this morning for where we're going. This moral failure, this God-ordained punishment, the people crying for relief, God hearing their cries and raising up a leader. And so with that, let's go on to verse 4. It says, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. She would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went to her to settle disputes. And so God heard his people's cry, and he raised up another judge. He raised up Deborah. She was a prophetess. She would hear from God and speak to the people on his behalf. Right? A prophet wasn't telling the future. It wasn't necessarily prophesying about what was going to happen. Sometimes that was in there. We see that in Isaiah, some prophecies. But often what the prophet was doing is they were speaking on behalf of God. God would say something to them. They would share it with the people. And we don't know a whole lot about Deborah, but we do know she's the only female judge listed in the scriptures. So she is a woman in this role that wasn't traditionally held by women, and she's the only judge that did both legal rulings and spiritual leadership. But she's not mentioned anywhere else in the scriptures other than Judges chapter 4 and 5, and we know nothing of her husband other than his name. He's not mentioned anywhere either. But then things get really interesting, because in verse 6 it says, she summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh and Naphtali, and said to him, hasn't the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, deploy the troops on Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the Naphtalites and the Zebulunites. And I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, his chariots and his infantry, to the Wadi Kishon to fight against you, and I will hand them over to you. And verse 6 is what struck me. Now, there's some translations that say that the Lord has commanded you, but many of the translations that I looked through translate it and say, hasn't the Lord commanded you to go? It's a question. You should know this. Hasn't the Lord commanded you? And I get the feeling that Barak knew what he was supposed to do. He just hadn't done it yet. See, that's the problem. Because delayed obedience is actually disobedience. And how often do we delay? The young people, you young people, you're spread all out. You used to sit down here in front, and it was really easy to pick on you. And if you want to do that again, those of us that are in these front rows, we would happily move back a few rows, and you could sit up front. It's great from a preacher's perspective when you guys are down in the front. But young people, say that, imagine you're doing something, you're playing video games, you're chatting with your friends, maybe you're outside shooting hoops, you're working on homework, you're on TikTok. I don't know what you guys do. It's been a long time since I was a young person or had one in my house. But you're doing something, and your parents ask you to do something for them. They ask you to take out the garbage. Tomorrow's trash day in Kalona, right? So they ask you to take out the garbage. You say, okay, I will. And you go back to doing what you were doing. Now, you're not a bad person. Your intent is there. You truly intend to take out the garbage, just not right now. And after some time passes, your parents, they yell back to your room or outside to where you're shooting hoops or whatever, and they say, don't forget, you still need to take out the garbage. And you reply, and you're like, I will. Right? We've all heard it. We've all done it. I intend to do that. I am going to do that. We have every intent, just not right now. And then the following morning, you're getting some breakfast. You're grabbing a piece of toast or some orange juice, and you hear a racket outside, and you realize the garbage truck has just gone by, and your garbage is not out. See, you had every intent to take it out, but you never got it done. And delayed obedience is actually disobedience. And I've said it before for myself that God called me for years to be in the ministry before I responded. The first time, the first time I ever preached here at Kalona Mennonite in 2016, I actually shared my story of how God had been calling me to the ministry for years and how I'd failed to respond until he finally pretty much hit me upside the head and said, "You're going to do this." And I've often wondered, what has been the price of my disobedience? It's nice to call it delayed obedience because it sounds better, but it's disobedience. What has been the price of my disobedience and delaying to do what God told me to do? Who hasn't heard the message of Jesus because I didn't respond when I was supposed to? And that weighs heavy on me. And with Barak, see, Barak, he was promised a victory. It was like, if God's going to defeat these guys for you. I mean, wouldn't you want to go into battle knowing that God had already secured the victory? That's the kind of battle I want to go into, right? It's a no-brainer. Lead a group of people, do what God says, and then God does all his work, and you get the credit and the recognition for being there, for obeying. But Barak, he delayed, and he didn't immediately do what God told him. And in him, I see not only this delayed obedience, but I see conditional obedience. Because continuing in verse 8, it said, Barak said to her, to Deborah, "If you go with me, I'll go. But if you will not, I will not go." Now, I can kind of see where Barak is coming from. Was this an inappropriate request? Because, I can see how he could justify it. Remember, Deborah's the prophetess, right? She's the mouthpiece of God. If I'm going into battle, I'd love to have God's spokesperson right there beside me. What if God has something he wants you to do during battle? What if he, now's the time to forge forward or now's the time to pull back? I want to have God's spokesperson there with me. And maybe that was Barak's thinking, but that wasn't God's plan. And Barak's obedience was conditional. If you accompany me, then I'll do it. But if you're not going to accompany me, then I'm out. I'm not going to do this if you don't accompany me. Barak's obedience was dependent on circumstances, which makes it disobedience. And how often do we do the same thing? Oh, I'll forgive them if they apologize. If they don't apologize, I'm not going to forgive them. Or maybe I'll increase my giving if I get a raise. I really can't. If I don't get a raise, I can't afford it. I need everything that I make to survive. But if God provides a raise for me, then I'll increase my giving. God, I'll obey you if, fill in the blank. That's the problem. Because just like delayed obedience, conditional obedience is actually disobedience. When God tells us to do something, we're not the ones that get to set the conditions or the timetable. We're just to obey completely, immediately, and unconditionally. And so Barak, he made this condition with Deborah, and surprisingly, to me at least, she went along with it. Because verse 9 continues, she says, "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you're taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. So Deborah understood that God works through his people. She understood that God was going to bring judgment on Sisera and the Canaanites. Right? But she went along. She went along, but she told Barak that I'm coming, but the honor for this is not going to be yours. The honor is going to go through a woman. And my guess, this is just me. My guess is that Barak probably thought that woman was going to be Deborah, and he was maybe okay with that. Right? This spokesperson for God, this prophetess, this judge of Israel, if she gets the credit, that's good. Right? I mean, how many other women would be on the battlefield? How many other women? Probably none, right? And if Deborah was with him, he'd at least have the front row seat to what God was doing. He would be right there. But in telling Barak that the honor would not be his, God was telling him he was going to miss out on something. He was going to miss out on the honor that God planned to give to him. He was going to miss out on the blessing that God intended to pour over him. And it makes me wonder. I wonder what God had in store for Barak. What was he going to miss out on? And what about ourselves? What about you? Have you ever wondered what honor, what blessing you're missing out on because of your own lack of obedience? Because of your own delayed or conditional obedience, which is disobedience? We disobey God because we think we're going to miss out. Don spoke on that last week. We allow people to influence us, but our family, our neighbors, our community, professional influencers, we allow them to influence us because we want what they have. We think, well, if we're like them, we'll get what they have. They're doing this and they seem happy, so if I do that, then I'll be happy. Right? We give into temptation because we want something, and we're afraid that if we resist the temptation, we're going to miss out. FOMO, fear of missing out. We see it all the time. We see people that want to be involved in everything because they don't want to miss anything. And disobedience, like all sin, it appears to have this short-term reward. There's something shiny that we want to pursue because we don't want to miss out. We want to have that. But obedience requires sacrifice. If obedience didn't require sacrifice, everybody would do it. Right? If it didn't require us to sacrifice, everybody would naturally be obedient. But we don't want to sacrifice. We don't want to let go. We want to pursue the things that make us happy, to achieve our own blessings. But that's the opposite, because what if disobeying God causes us to miss out on his blessings? What if giving into temptation causes us to miss out on the very best that God has intended for you? Which would you rather have? The short-term gratification of sin or the long-term blessing that comes from God for resisting and passing the test? Barak, he chose the short term. His conditional obedience, which is a nice way of saying his disobedience, caused him to miss out on the honor that God was wanting to give to him. And I read this week, I thought this was a great quote. It says, in the Bible, we often highlight the miracles and hide the mess. We highlight the miracles and hide the mess. You know what I'm talking about? Noah and the ark, right? Noah, we talk about the miracle. Noah was a good man. Noah built the ark. He and his family were saved. All the animals were saved. And so we highlight the miracle. We don't talk very often about Noah being drunk after he got off the ark. Right? We hide the mess. I haven't seen a children's story about Noah and the ark that gets into that. We hide the mess. Here in Judges, we see the miracle of God routing the Canaanites. Barak, he assembles the 10,000 men like he's commanded. They take on Sisera, the commander, and Sisera with his 900 chariots, and Barak's men, they destroy the whole army. Verse 16 tells us not a single one of them was left. I mean, this is a huge military defeat. And then Sisera, he realizes what's happening. He takes off, right? He abandons all. He's running. He's fleeing. He's trying to save his life. He's given up on his army. He comes to this woman named Jael. Comes to her tent. He's exhausted. He's been traveling a while. He's, like I said, he was fleeing this battle. Who knows how far he went? He asks her for a drink. She gives him a drink. She convinces him to take a little rest. She covers him up with a rug so that he won't be seen if anyone would happen to come by. And he falls asleep from his exhaustion. Right? He takes a cat nap. He's asleep. She leaves the tent. She goes out. She gets a tent stake. She gets a hammer. She drives it through his temples and into the ground. The mess. While Barak and his army routed the Canaanites, it was this woman who destroyed the commander, who received the ultimate victory by taking out the top guy. She's the one who received the victory. In chapter 5, there's a victory song. I'm not going to go through it all this morning because it might be a little bit messier and more graphic than what some of you are comfortable with. But you have your own Bibles. You can read it. But it celebrates what Jael did. And in this victory song, Barak is almost an afterthought. He's hardly mentioned. And Jael is celebrated. The honor that God had planned for Barak was given to Jael because Barak was putting conditions on his obedience. And so what do we do with an account like this in the book of Judges? How can we apply it to our lives today? First, we need to look at that pattern in Judges, right? That pattern of moral failure followed by God-ordained punishment, which leads to finally a recognition and cries for deliverance and a godly leader in a time of peace. We need to look at our own lives. Are we somewhere in this cycle? Are we failing God's test? Are we giving in to temptation and living in moral failure? If we're going through a tough time in our lives, is it due to a moral failure in our own lives? I'm not saying there's a direct correlation there. Often we go through things that are tough in our lives for other reasons. But sometimes the bad things in our lives are the result of the way that we're living them. Is that the case? That's a question we should ask ourselves. Maybe there's some of you here that need to be more like Deborah. You're kind of in an odd position. Deborah was the only woman judge. She was in a role that people would not have expected her to be in. Maybe you're in a unique role. And maybe God is calling you to prod others to action. Women, maybe God is calling you to prod your husband to do what God wants him to do. I know I'm married to a woman like that. Right? She's often more in tune to God than I am, and she challenges me to listen and do what God's telling me to do, even when I don't want to. But I would also encourage each of you to look at your own life and what God is telling you to do. Are there areas in your life where you're trying to delay obedience? God, I'll do that when the kids are grown. I'll do that later. Maybe it's something that God has pointed out to you in the scriptures. I'll get around to that. Maybe it's something that the Holy Spirit is prodding you to do. Maybe to go and talk to someone. Maybe to encourage someone. Maybe you need to go and ask for forgiveness. Or maybe you need to forgive someone else. What is it in your life that God is telling you to do? Because your intent doesn't matter. Because if you're delaying obedience, you're actually being disobedient. Or where in your life are you wanting to be obedient if? God, if you increase my salary, I'll give more. Lord, if you heal me, then I'll do that. Or maybe your if is dependent on someone else. Well, if that person comes and asks for forgiveness, then I'll forgive them. Or if they come talk to me, I'll invite them over. If, I'll obey if. But again, conditional obedience isn't obedience at all. It's disobedience. Are there areas in your life where you're trying to be conditionally obedient? I would encourage everybody to search themselves. Is there something in your life that God is asking you to do that you've been delaying? Is there something in your life that God is telling you to do that you're putting conditions on? Ask God to help you see Him. Ask your spouse. They'll probably tell you. They'll help you recognize them. But let's be fully obedient without delay and without conditions, individually and as a body of believers here. What God expects, what Jesus repeatedly said, and when we do, we're less likely to miss out on the honor and the blessing that God really, really wants to give to us.